Welcome to the Just Ingredients podcast. I'm Cara Lynn, and here we talk all things nourishing to the mind, body, and soul. This is a place where you can find just good ingredients to life. Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm so excited for today's conversation because this is such an important and often overwhelming topic. We are diving into lead exposure, something that can feel scary as a parent or a consumer, but my hope is that today's episode will help educate, empower, and calm you. Our guest, Eric Ritter, is a specialist in consumer product design and manufacturing. After creating an affordable lead test kit back in 2019, Eric realized that most people only test for lead after exposure has already happened. Since then, he's been on a mission to change that by raising awareness and making proactive lead testing more accessible through social media and public education. Welcome, Eric, to the show.
Thanks for having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk more about lead.
Yeah, like I said, I have so many questions for you because it is a hot topic on social media, that is for sure. But before we delve into that, just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe what even sparked your interest in doing this.
Just taking a look at, what was available career-wise, I decided that I wanted to go, into business with myself, and I started making consumer products, and one of the ones that I made early on was a reagent test kit, which allows people to use chemicals to identify other chemicals so they can be safer. And I identified there was an opportunity in the marketplace where 3M was making a lot of money off of a lead testing kit, charging $5 per test. And the amount of chemicals that was in there was relatively low. So they were really making a huge margin. And I figured to compete, I can just make one that's 10 times cheaper. So I got into that in 2019, and I've always had a strong passion for innovation, and optimizing processes is something that I really enjoy doing. So, I really enjoy making this up and making it better. Fast forward a little bit more, I got a lot of customer service calls. Since then, I probably sold like 250,000 units of that swab test that I made in 2019. And of the people who I asked, the vast majority of them said they bought the test kit because their child already tested positive. And so at the time, didn't really understand like the gravity of that. But once I started delving deeper into it, once I identified that this newer glowing lead test was a thing that I could make and sell, I figured that, I should learn more about it. So I started talking to a lot of people who had actual exposure of their children, and really got to understand like what actually happens isn't just, oh, it's some bad news and there's some problems with the kids, ADHD symptoms and stuff like that. But it really can affect people's entire lives. So I became kind of like radicalized to prevent this from happening and derailing more people's lives, because the most common way they find out is because they're kids.
Okay, which I want to talk about that later of like, how do you even know your child has lead exposure? But before we get there, let's just start at the basics of like lead 101 here for all of our followers. What is lead and why can it be harmful today?
Well, lead's an element. It's naturally occurring, but it's not naturally occurring on the surface of the planet, and it's always in an insoluble form when it's in nature. So it binds with sulfur and it forms it's called a mineral called galena. It doesn't dissolve in water, and it's buried underground. So nobody has any business interacting with it. It's like oil or like lava or something. Like they're natural things, but you wouldn't encounter them in day-to-day life. And because of that, no organism has a mechanism for dealing with lead. And so lead acts kind of like calcium in the body. It has a similar electrostatic charge, and it interferes with neurons and a lot of different processes, mitochondrial stuff too. And it's not good when we encounter it.
Okay, so where is lead still hiding today then?
The biggest source is definitely housing. There's like 36 million homes in the United States that have lead-based paint inside of them. It was widely dispersed through the atmosphere when they put it in gasoline, so it's in a lot of soil in heavily trafficked areas in the 50s, 60s, and 70s if there was a lot of cars around, or if there was like unregulated smelting or recycling activities during that time. There could be heavy ground contamination. Because it's in the soil, it's also in all the food, generally speaking. It's in older consumer products, it's in older plates. It pops up still in certain instances where the regulations just aren't all encompassing, and there's some, like, blind spots that allow it to be put onto, like, the outside of baby bottles, for example. Sometimes, bizarrely, it's, like, on the outside in high concentrations.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these common culprits of lead. So you talked about the lead-based paint. These are usually in homes built before like 1978 or so?
That's when it was banned in residential housing, and the risk goes up a lot as the house gets older. So it's something like 90% of homes built before 1940 have lead-based paint, like around 50% of them that were built before 1960 have lead-based paint, and it's like 30 something percent from 1960 to 1978. So it was getting phased out over time. Lead-based paint used to be like the gold standard for paint, and it was just really easy to mine. But this is before zinc and titanium became like uh, easily accessed in the Earth's crust, and there wasn't really good ways to process them. So once those came into favor, like zinc and titanium are way less toxic than lead.
And so if someone has an older home, one, how do they test if they have lead exposure in there? And two, how do they get rid of that lead-based paint?
Well, the first one's a lot easier than the second one. So you can either hire a professional, they would use an X-ray gun. It would run like 300 bucks. They would tell you if you have lead-based paint or not. They're not allowed to say if you have a hazard, which means that there's lead on surfaces that bear friction or impact, or if there's lead dust on the floor. The test kit that I make, you can easily just spray the solution, shine the flashlight, and it will glow green if there is lead on the surface or on the floor. You can even see specks of dust. So identifying it isn't really that difficult, but the remediation may be challenging. So if you're trying to take it out, if you just saw into the wall, you could generate a lot of dust. It's probably best to hire a professional or take an RRP course. They're normally available for free, run by the EPA, and that'll teach you how professionals deal with lead. It involves a lot of plastic, a lot of water on the surface, so it doesn't make any dust. Never doing any dry sanding or dry scraping. It's a whole thing. But most of the time, the hazard can be immediately fixed just by identifying its presence. So a huge source is older windows, and every time they go up and down, the friction just generates a ton of dust. So if you identify that you have lead-based paint or lead paint on the window and there's dust on the floor, on the windowsill, you can just stop using the window and clean it up. And then you can like basically do an interim measure to prevent further spreading of lead until you have somebody address it down the line. So knowing makes people able to deal with the issue. And I think a lot of the concerns around lead lie in not being exactly sure what's going on.
And so if people have lead-based paint homes, they should not do it themselves, try to get rid of that lead paint by themselves, because I've heard of people doing that and then their kids or themselves become really sick. And so what's making them sick? Inhaling that lead?
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, if you have lead dust in the air and you inhale it, it's really easy to get just a ton of lead. Adults shouldn't consume more than 6.6 micrograms of lead per day, and children not more than 2.2 micrograms of lead. So I'm sorry, 7.7 for adults, 2.2 for children. There's at least 1,000 micrograms per square centimeter on the wall when you have lead-based paint. So there's just a ton of lead that could come off, and making any kind of dust and inhaling that's really risky. Another way people sometimes remove lead paint or old paint is just by using a heat gun or a blowtorch, which seems insane, but that's definitely not advised because the lead could vaporize, you could inhale it. Um, and then afterwards, if you're not aware, like I've seen a lot of people, they'll, interrogate their garage, and it'll turn out that there's dust all over the place because somebody sanded an old piece of furniture in there. Somebody ground down some glass or something, and there's just lead dust everywhere. So if you have dust in your house from lead, like, you may or may not see it depending on the quantity. If you sweep it up, it may look like it's all gone, but there's oftentimes enough residue there that, it's really easy to get exposed, especially if you're a kid putting your hand on the floor. That will adhere to your hand and then get wherever.
Interesting. Okay, so what about though my mom lives in an old home and I always am concerned about her pipes and plumbing fixtures. Is that also a culprit of being exposed to lead?
I forgot to mention that earlier because I forgot. Lead water service lines are definitely an issue, and the cool thing about those is people can test for that themselves right now. They just need a coin or a screwdriver, go to the spot in your house where the water comes in from the street. That's normally near your hot water heater. It might be, around where the water meter is also. Just go in between the water meter or your hot water heater and the wall, scrape that pipe with some hard object, and you'll see soft silvery streaks. The lead is soft, so you can dig right into it, and you'll know presumptively that you have lead there. And so the protocol for that is always just run the water cold first to flush out the water that's been sitting there overnight or for an extended period of time. Moving water through a lead pipe isn't going to leach very much unless the municipality has been really irresponsible. That's what happened in Flint, Michigan. It wasn't that there was all of a sudden lead pipes. The lead pipes had been there for years, but there wasn't a big problem with water contamination because the municipality treated the water properly, essentially making it harder, and harder water doesn't dissolve stuff. It builds up scale, as we all know. But hard water is a lot safer than soft water because you don't want acidic water just dissolving the inside of the pipes and then you wind up drinking it.
Interesting. And I feel like water is easier to deal with than paint because water you also can there's so many filters out there these days that show that they filter out those heavy metals.
Definitely. Any NSF 53 rated filter is going to do a really good job at removing the lead. And of course, you can always opt to cook with water that you bring in, but it's the not knowing that really gets people in trouble. And the remediation for the pipes, luckily, has been subsidized by the government. A few years ago, there was a bill passed that allocated $20 billion to removing lead water service lines throughout the United States. Which is just like an awesome common sense idea. Nobody should be drinking water through a lead straw.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so I've seen on your page you talk about imported pottery. And I've seen you take your little tests to the pottery and it will show up that it's got lead, glaze or something on it. And so is this really a concern?
Yeah, apparently. It's predominantly in older ceramics. Like, I've seen some new stuff off of Amazon. I mean, Amazon is kind of the Wild West, of items. Anyone can pretty much sell something on Amazon. So, if you're buying ceramics or stuff from there, they may not have gone through the proper channels to get the leach test done. The Consumer Product Safety Commission mandates a leach test, which is basically a dose of boiling vinegar gets put in the ceramic article, left for 24 hours, and then the amount of lead that goes into the vinegar is tested. If it's over a certain amount, it's not safe. If it's under a certain amount, it's safe. So they don't actually test the ceramic itself, it just does it leach. So if there's lead on the outside, it's not going to be picked up by that. If there's lead underneath the glaze, it's also not going to be picked up. I guess it could, in theory, be worn away later, but for the interim, it would be safe. So it's somewhat of a concern. I haven't seen very many brand new things other than from certain stores, really test positive oftentimes in a way that's dangerous.
Can you say what stores those are?
Well, I was recently in Home Goods and they have a terrible selection of and the craziest thing is that a lot of the dishes were from England. This one brand, I forgot the brand's name, but they were from England and like they're was 70,000 parts per million lead. That's like 7% lead when I scanned it with the X-ray gun. Yeah, and, they would definitely fail the leach test, so I don't know what happened there. All those stores that kinda sell, like, Home Goods, Marshalls, like TJ Maxx, they all kind of are the same in some similar ways. They sell, like, these, fake plants and all this stuff for your house, towels and such. Probably not the best place to get your dishes. Somewhere like IKEA, though, much safer. IKEA swore off of lead, like, 8 or 10 years ago, and they've been pretty good about that.
Oh,
Um
that's good to know.
Yeah, even someplace like Target, Target Dishes, Mainstays is a brand from Target, I think, and it had, like, up to 1,000 parts per million lead, but that's significantly lower than it seems is going to pose a problem through normal use of the item.
Interesting. Okay, so the home good item should be more of a visual decoration in your house rather than a eat off of plate.
100%, yeah. There's nothing wrong with home goods, but just I wouldn't trust their plates to not have potentially egregious amounts of lead on them.
All right, that's good to know. Okay, what about, and you mentioned this for a quick second, but you see it on social media a lot, and that's baby bottles. So, what is the deal with baby bottles?
Well, everybody's kind of more aware of microplastics, probably for good reason. I mean, doesn't sound good, and, there's no reason to use plastic if you could use glass, right? And so oftentimes these glass bottles have decorations on the outside, markings, brand markings, graduations for how much formula or milk you're going to put in there. And those oftentimes on glass have lead for whatever reason, probably because it's just the way they've been doing it for so long. And lead tends to make things that you bake on even stronger. So this is one of those regulatory blind spots that I was talking about earlier. So the leach test won't capture any of that because it's the inside. There's no lead on the inside. But obviously, the child might touch the outside, and so it could still pose a problem. The Consumer Product Safety Commission does have a rule saying that there can't be more than 90 parts per million in items used for children, like intended for use by children, is the exact language. And the way that they test the baby bottles is they break the entire thing up into dust, and then they take some of that dust and they test it, and then they see, okay, say how much lead is in this dust. But the thing is, when you take a baby bottle that probably weighs, like, let's say 150 grams, and there's only 35 milligrams of lead or of paint on the outside, that gets distributed really evenly, and the average goes down. It's almost like if you had an apple and you put a little bit of salt on the outside, if you lick the salt, you would taste it right away. But if you blend up the whole apple, you won't even know it's there.
Well, first of all, is it on the paint on the glass bottle, or is that where it's coming from?
Yeah, it's on the decorative markings on the brand or whatever.
So, is there enough lead in that paint to be a concern then?
Probably, yeah, easily. If it's glowing, there's significant amounts. So the test kit doesn't like do anything but react with lead that it touches and then turn it into a form that fluoresces green so you can see it. So if it's reacting, there's enough lead on the surface to allow for this reaction to be visible to the naked eye. It varies. Like some of the brands, they glow slightly. It doesn't really come off. Other ones, it's like pouring off, and those are much more concerning versus the ones that glow faintly, and if you rub your finger on it, it doesn't come off.
Okay, so I have a lot of new moms that follow me, so they're probably like, "What?" So, if they found a glass baby bottle with no paint on the outside, then they should be fine.
Yeah, definitely.
And so that's just an easier way to look at it, is to avoid the painted glass bottles and you'll be okay.
Yeah, yeah, and on my website, detectlead.com, I have a whole list. You have to put in your email, but it's, detectlead.com/baby25, and there's all the baby bottles from this year that I tested. I used the test kit, I also used the X-ray gun, and just to give a little bit more of an insight. Some of the bottles have, tiny amounts of lead in the glass, not a concern. 100 parts per million lead in glass isn't gonna do anything. It's not coming out. I did a leach test myself. I microwaved, vinegar in there. I left it sit there for a few days. Then I tested it. I also have an atomic absorption spectrometer, which uses light to detect really trace amounts of lead. It goes down to 1 part per billion sensitivity-wise, and, I didn't find any lead, in the liquid from those baby bottles, and vinegar is way more harsh than milk or formula. So I don't think that trace amounts of lead in, ceramic articles is really a problem.
Okay, that's good to know. So you're saying trace amounts of lead, are not a harm. So I'm actually curious, what's the difference between lead in food, trace amounts of lead in food versus lead in these household items?
Well, there's, um, a lot less lead in the food, basically. So, like, if you encounter a household item or paint or something like that, there's millions of micrograms of lead potentially sitting right there. Whether you ingest them or not is like a roll of the dice. If you wind up touching it, if it winds up getting into the air somehow, you're going to ingest it. If it just is some leaded object sitting on the shelf or some sinker fishing weights in the garage and nobody winds up touching them, there's not going to be a problem. Food, on the other hand, you definitely ingest. but the concentrations of lead in food generally are pretty low.
Okay, so let's talk about food and what's too much, things like that, because food that is grown in the soil, so potatoes, carrots, spinach, strawberries, I mean, the list goes on, they're going to contain lead because they're grown in the soil, and soil and water and the Earth's crust has lead, correct?
Yeah, well, it does now because of the lead in the gas. But so, like, suppose you have a farm and you've been farming this soil for the last 30 years. There's been no lead in the gas. So the amount of lead that goes into the soil has been virtually zero for the last 30 years. That means that the food is consistently removing lead. Unfortunately, people wind up eating the food. But fortunately for all of us, it's 2025 and not 1995, where there was significantly more lead in the soil because it hasn't been removed over time with the plants for the last 20 30 years. So yeah, it is in the soil, and foods that are grown closer to the ground, like spinach, much more likely to have lead than an apple. That's all the way up in a tree. Corn, much less likely to have lead than um, beets, which literally grow underground and are right there next to right next to the lead, essentially.
Okay, but in all the thousands of years of people eating fruits and veggies, no one has gotten lead toxicity that I know of eating too many fruits and veggies. And I believe the reason is they have cofactors in them that help get the lead and other heavy metals out of your body. They've got the calcium and zinc and glutathione and B vitamins and all the things that help remove that lead. So are we making it more of a concern than it really should be?
I mean, I think that eating whole foods is less likely to give you exposure than eating processed foods to like the stuff that you might not want to absorb. I think that just as a factor of time, the amount of lead in the food has gone down significantly. And no lead is better, but some lead is kind of like inevitable at this point. This is a relatively new problem though. Lead gas was only invented in the 1930s, and it really started being burned heavily in, the 1960s, 70s, 80s until they banned it. So it's kind of like a new phenomenon, but the food has had less lead in it now than it has for 50 years. So it's definitely getting better.
And that's because, like you said, the plants over time have soaked up that lead out of the soil and gotten rid of it.
Definitely, yeah. And that's why that foods that are grown organically have slightly more lead than non-organically grown foods. If you grow foods that are, you're feeding them ammonia, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in the form of pellets that have no lead, is going to bring in less lead to the spot that you're farming from than if you bring plants from elsewhere that you what do you call it? Like
Rotated.
decompose. Yeah, exactly. And then you add a little bit more lead back into the soil. But the thing is that the average blood lead level of an American of childbearing age right now is under 1 microgram per deciliter. The like elevated definition for children is 3.5, and those figures, the 7.7 micrograms a day for an adult and the 2.2 micrograms a day for a child, are intended to keep blood levels below 1. So you'd essentially have to eat 10 times more than either of those figures every day in a sustained way in order to get above 3.5.
Okay, so what happens if people do get above 3.5? Like, what are some of these health issues people might see in their kids?
Well, if you get above 3.5, that basically just triggers, the CDC to come and investigate why your kid has an elevated blood lead level. And that number is really only derived from the most poisoned 2.5% of all children. So that's kind of like the game that the government plays is they try to keep it down below a certain number, and it's always decreasing over time because the average goes down over time. Childhood lead poisoning starts to kind of like do damage to the brain in a statistically significant way above about 2 micrograms per deciliter. The kinds of symptoms would be, increased erratic behavior, ADHD symptoms, potentially behavioral problems, IQ loss. And the IQ loss is logarithmic, so it's not a straight curve down. The more lead poison you get, the more IQ you lose in a direct relationship. It kind of goes like all at once, you lose the most, like up to like 7. probably micrograms per deciliter, you lose most, and then it kind of evens out. So you won't be so much worse off if you're at a 12 versus if you're at a 7. But it's best to keep that number as low as reasonably possible, I think.
Is this a huge problem in America, though? Kids dealing with too much lead?
If it was, I think the blood lead reference number would be higher, and it would be like a universal problem. Because if you have a vector that affects everybody, like food, the food supply, is everybody who eats the food having lead poisoning? No. If the food was really that big of a concern, then everything would be different. Everybody would notice because the entire population eats food. And so the fact that only 2.5% of the kids have these elevated blood lead levels, and then when the CDC shows up, they're not like, "Oh, well, it's this bag of Cheerios." No, it's like there's lead paint in the house. There's water service lines. They're playing with old keys. Don't give your kids old keys, everybody. They're eating off of old dishes. They're interacting with lead in some way that is beyond what is normal. And luckily, there's ever decreasing amounts of lead in food. But lead in food just always makes the news because it doesn't sound good. Oh, there's lead in Lunchables. Remember that one? The amount of lead in a Lunchable is not really that much. Lunchables are terrible for you in other ways that are way more extreme than lead. There was only 375 nanograms of lead per Lunchable. So that's about 1/8 of a child's like maximum daily alchemy, that maximum daily amount of lead that they could consume, basically. So it just sounds terrible, lead in food. Oh my gosh, Well, like, newsflash. There used to be lead in, like, right here. I actually have this. This is a can of Similac baby food, and this solder right here is made of lead. And there's significant amounts of lead. They banned the lead in the solder in 1988, I think. And there was this really seminal research study done in the early 70s that showed that, like, the amount of leaded cans in America was like 90% of all canned food had lead in the solder. Yeah, and it was really significantly exposing everybody's, children, adults, anybody who's eating canned food was getting so much lead at that time. So, it's much better than it used to be. You never find lead in a can today, luckily. Even though you will find Proposition 65 warnings on something like corn, and the Proposition 65 is for zero point 0.5 micrograms of lead per day exposure, which is about 2 Lunchables worth.
Okay, so since you brought up Prop 65, let's talk about Prop 65. First of all, let's just tell the listeners what it is, and then I do have some questions for you.
Okay, well, Proposition 65 is a pretty far-reaching environmental safety law from California, which basically is about reproductive health and cancer risk. So the way the law works is they assess how much is statistically significantly likely to give people cancer, more than a 1 in 100,000 chance, increased risk of cancer, and then they divide that number by 1,000, and then that's the reportable limit. Below that is like the safe harbor limit where you don't have to report it, even though it may be there. And so what this is designed to do is to increase consumer awareness of toxins in their environment. And, there's like that ongoing joke, like, oh, this only causes cancer in California. And it very well may be that something bears a label, but the amount of whatever is in there might be insignificant to human health. And, you probably don't want to put a piece of rubber that has a Prop 65 warning for something in your mouth. But if there is a Prop 65 warning on something else, it very well may not be relevant to your health, realistically.
Okay, well, then that's confusing to people then because, I mean, anything that has a Prop 65 label on it, unsafe or toxic?
No, and whole foods are excluded from the law, which is California's probably biggest export, conveniently excluded entirely from the law. So all the potatoes, I don't know, potatoes don't really come from California, but
The
all,
strawberries.
yeah, yeah, certainly all the fruits, all the vegetables, all whole foods are excluded from Prop 65 warnings. So as a result, nobody really has looked into it that much, but there is evidence to suggest that, oh, a lot of these whole foods have pretty decent amount of lead, and a lot of them would have a Prop 65. Also, if you have a company with less than 10 employees, you're also exempt from reporting on Prop 65. So the law is like pretty expansive, but like it's not the end all be all. It does do something though.
Are there any other current protections out there in place to protect customers from lead exposure?
I mean, the CSPC rule, with limitations, that's a big one. Banning lead in paint was huge. Banning lead in gas was huge. The water service line replacement is huge. There's some federal programs for remediating lead-based paint, but there's like a $500 million backlog where the money hasn't been spent. Hopefully they overhaul that soon. But in terms of like items you might buy, not entirely. I mean, there's people just, get kind of get the picture and they say, "Hey, we should stop using lead in this. We should try to source things that have less lead." And over time, that's just I think just the pressure will force the market in the right direction.
Okay, so I'm curious. You know that I make protein powder. And so I want to talk to you about protein powders because you hear about it in the headlines. "Oh, there's lead in supplements, there's lead in protein powders." And so I want this to come from someone with no bias, someone just from a science based view on these questions. But when people see headlines about lead in supplements or protein powders, should that fear them? How should they interpret that?
Um, I mean, it's like cause for like looking more into it. So I'm looking at your chocolate protein powder, 12 parts per billion. I mean, how much protein powder? Like this is how you actually figure out how much you're actually ingesting. You take the parts per billion, and then you take the amount of grams and you multiply them, and that's the amount of nanograms that you wind up ingesting. So let's say like the average scoop of protein powder is 50 grams. If you have 12 parts per billion, that's going to be 600 nanograms. That's just above the Prop 65 of zero point 0.5, but it's zero point 0.6. And so if you're an adult, you could do that 10 times a day and you'll be under your total allocament of lead for the day. So that's an easy way to understand that. Basically, you just take the grams, the amount of grams, and you times it by the number of parts per billion. And so if you're looking at something like baby formula, where a child would consume like 100 grams of formula per day, if you have 10 parts per billion, that's 1,000 nanograms. That's 1 microgram. That's still half of what they say kids should take. And that's twice what they were going for when they had suggested 5 parts per billion as like the max for child food. So, but that assumes zero exposure elsewhere. So it all comes down to cumulative exposure. It's not like there's products on the market, generally speaking, that are going to do you in with lead. It's the combination of consuming all these high lead sources, and then the environmental sources are still the top.
So there's all this fear mongering out there about food when the fear mongering should probably be about the lead based paints and the cookware or the things like that.
Yeah, obviously. That's like and that's how I really got so, obsessed with this. I started interacting with, Let's Safe Mama, and she, Tamara Rubin, and, like, her family was poisoned by paint. But after speaking with her several times, I started realizing, like, the amount of personal drama that she experienced from this event has kind of really flavored the way she approaches things. And she's all about, like, 0 lead is best. And obviously 0 lead is best. But what's even better than having 0 lead is having 0 stress. Even if you have a little bit of lead, kind of just moving past it is probably healthier than staying stuck on it for a protracted period of time. So if you look at the average blood lead level of a person born in the 1970s, it was 17.5 micrograms per deciliter. That is very high. Today's standards, you would consider the kid severely poisoned, and then the parent would go up on the computer and say, "Oh my gosh, this does not look good at all." But every single child probably had way more than 17 because that was an average across society, and children are much smaller, but they still consume relatively high amounts of food and water, and they breathe a lot, and, inhaling lead from the, fumes in the air is gonna be much higher if you're breathing a lot than an adult who's much larger, and they excrete more of the lead every day. They put a lot of the lead into their bones more so than a child does. And so, the children from the 1970s, like, do you write them all off? Of course not.
I'm gonna
Yes,
say I'm a child from the '70s.
of course, and you're doing perfectly fine. There are, like, if you zoom out at the big picture, there's increases in neuroticism, decreases in openness to experience, there's a general decrease in IQ, there's, increase in impulsivity. There's most of the effects in adults constitute, increased blood pressure and increases in atherosclerosis, which happen around that 2 micrograms per deciliter for adults. And so people from, that time period were exposed to so much more lead, but there isn't like a total dearth of smart people or capable people or people who have, stuff going on from the time period. So when you're a modern parent and you find that your kid has an elevated blood lead level, it's a very easy trap to fall into to really freak out and say, "Oh my gosh, their level is 5. Their level is 4." And it's scary because, you read it and the evidence says, "Oh, well, there's going to be a loss in IQ." But okay, not the end of the world. The end of the world is treating them different, treating yourself different, just losing perspective on the fact that there's hope. You know, just because you have lead exposure doesn't mean that it's over. It doesn't mean that you've made a huge mistake that you can't go back on unless you don't let it go. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of recourse for parents who find lead in their house, the contractors, are you going to be able to sue this contractor? Like, they weren't following basic laws about lead safety. Like, you think they're going to have money to pay you out? Like, their insurance isn't going to cover their malfeasance because they broke the law. So it's hard to get, like, it's hard to get money for lead, like, exposure, and it's just a nightmare. Like, I've never seen a parent who no, that's not fair. I've seen a lot of different parents who have been exposed and their children been exposed, and, it's not the right way to find out about it. That's why I'm so obsessed with selling this test kit, because if somebody just tests first, they don't wait for their kid to have positive blood lead, and then their kid's not gonna have positive blood lead if they see the danger in their house. It's like landmines in your yard. Like, you can walk around until you step on it, or you can just find it. One of them is gonna leave you with potentially scars, permanent damage, and some trauma. The other one, you just are like, "Okay."
Let's take a quick break to hear from our show sponsor. It is important to make sure you're getting quality ingredients that are good for your body, inside and out. Some personal lubricants contain ingredients like parabens, glycerin, or petrochemicals, which have been linked to hormone disruption. Coconu's organic and natural lubricants are thoughtfully made with high quality, safe ingredients such as organic coconut oil, coconut water, beeswax, and cocoa butter. They are cruelty free, made in the USA, and their packaging is plastic free. To Coconu, details matter. For an exclusive discount code, head to coconu.com. That is coconut without the T. And use code Carolyn15 for 15% off your order. My code stacks with their on-site discount, so trust me and try it today. Now back to the show. Okay, so your lead test um is it for food and objects, or just for like the walls, the pipes, the plates, the bottles, things like that?
And not for food, because the limited detection is generally around like 500 parts per million, and that's going to screen for any paint that's not modern. So in between 1978 and 2008, you could have up to 600 parts per million lead in paint. Prior to 1978, it's like at least 5,000. Realistically, it's like hundreds of thousands if you have pure lead-based paint. But the paint's always over painted, and there's this layering thing. There's a whole thing. So it's for, solid materials, plates, paint, metal, rubber that has lead, dust and debris of lead, what are those things? Like a wine glass,
Oh yeah, crystal
lead
glasses.
crystal. And, even the lead crystal, it's 250,000 parts per million lead, but you're only gonna get about 10 micrograms per glass of wine that you let sit in there for 30 minutes. So, when you have those tough matrices like paint, sorry, not like paint, like glass, it's hard for the lead to come out relative to something soft like paint. And when you have paint that's turning into dust, you definitely want to be concerned about that, because it's so easy for dust to get into your body. The dust particles are so small, they're so easy to ingest, and then dissolve or digest. There's a million ways to get exposed to lead, but only some are really going to give you an elevated blood lead level. And, like, granted, nobody's going to say there's a safe amount of lead because there's no evidence to support that lead is ever good. Like, lead is always somewhat toxic, but just to the same degree that, like, the sun is somewhat toxic. But if I don't go in the sun, I'm gonna have way bigger problems than getting a sunburn.
Well, you
I'm
could
gonna be
say
like,
that about anything. You could say water is toxic. Too much water can kill you. If you don't filter your water, it's got stuff. I mean, we can say that about everything. So we've got to talk reasonable amounts. And you had said something earlier about, oh, shoot, someone wants zero lead in food. Well, that's not even possible these days because if you use real food, like real ingredients from the earth, produce, it's going to have that naturally occurring lead. But so many of the artificial ingredients out there also contain lead. And so if you're eating just all artificial food to avoid the food from nature that has the lead, you're still getting the lead. So there's no way to avoid it.
but there's 2 ways that you get lead in food. It's either contamination or adulteration. Adulteration is when somebody adds lead intentionally to the food, and that's what happens with spices. So avoid spices as much as you can, and if you do, use spices in your food, don't skimp on the cost. Get something that's from a reputable brand, a big brand that is probably actually testing their stuff and cares what happens. If you have a fly-by-night dollar store brand bottle of spice, who's gonna be held accountable for that?
Well, yeah, and companies that are proud of their levels will show their COAs on their website, or if you email in, they'll give you your COA, and so you can see exactly how much is in there. It's those that don't wanna give the COAs that I'm like, "Okay, why don't you wanna show me that COA?"
Because there's nothing good in there. That's basically why. And I think that context really is important when you're talking about lead in food because, anybody can construe that to be so bad, right? If you say, "Oh, there's level of lead," and, but it just realistically is not gonna matter because it's not like you don't eat any other food. If you're eating, certain kinds of food, cassava, you have hundreds of parts per billions in cassava flour. Does that mean that every kid who eats cassava flour has an elevated level? No, that would be front page news right away. So we do have this mechanism in the United States of monitoring blood levels, and it's not as robust. Like, it's not even close to as robust as it could be, but it does screen for stuff that will really, really do you in.
Well, and then also going back to the lead in food conversation, there is a correct way to measure the lead. Like you said, you were saying, like, use the grams, because a lot of people out there on social media are not measuring correctly and will say, like, oh, this has got like 10,000% more lead in it than you should eat. And they're like testing a whole bag of protein powder or a whole jar of tooth powder rather than just one serving size.
Yeah, the serving size is super important to understand. Like, I understand, like, certainly some people probably don't eat the serving size when they consume food, but it's like you need to know the number of grams that you're actually consuming. So, like salt, for example, there was this whole thing about um, Selena Naturally is a company, not Redmond's, it's
There
Celtic Sea Salt.
Yeah, there's been a lot about different salt companies, so let's talk about that.
So the salt, you have like, let's say there's 500 parts per billion lead in the salt. Sounds like a lot. 1 gram is going to be that California Proposition 65 number. So it really depends on how much salt you consume. If you have POTS, which is a condition where people need to consume like 30 grams of salt per day, it's a totally different game than if you're consuming 3 grams a day. And so if you consume 30 grams of salt a day, or if you're on a really low carb diet and you consume a ton of salt, be more mindful about the kind of salt that you eat. I'm not a big believer in the fact that like salt has, meaningful amounts of trace micronutrients in it. Like, it's mostly the sodium chloride. Like, it's not a really good source to get trace elements that you can get from a vitamin pill or you just get from your regular diet. It's not like we're all running around here deficient in, those natural sea salts don't even have iodine.
Well, and yeah, there are people that are definitely deficient in nutrients though, so I'm like, wherever you can get your nutrients from, let's get it because we got too many people eating too many ultra processed foods lacking the nutrients.
Well, and that's, yeah, it's not fair for me to say we're not lacking, certain essential micronutrients, but the amounts that are in salt are pretty trace. They are predominantly sodium chloride. The amount of iron that you might find in salt, it might be very close to the amount of lead in the salt, depending on where it's coming from. Like, salt isn't like a thing that's necessarily coming from a pristine environment that's lead free. So it's, there's like lead and salt. Like, I don't know. I don't eat a ton of salt. I don't think it's really a good idea for my blood pressure. So it's not on my life.
Okay, so let's say get a COA from the salt company and it shows lead. So, should consumers be concerned when they see any amount of lead on a COA?
Not right off the bat, but if they use the method of multiplying the amount of grams they consume by the parts per billion, they'll wind up with the amount of nanograms, and then they can extrapolate how bad that actually is. I built a little calculator on my website that allows you to, it's on a blog post about leaded baby formula, and it allows you to plug in the parts per billion and the number of grams you consumed of it, and you're going to give you a number of micrograms of or nanograms of lead, and then that's going to line it up with a bunch of different metrics. So the proposition 65, that 2.2 or 7.7 number, which is like the kinetic amount of lead you can consume. I can't remember the acronym. It's so crazy. It's like 5 letters. Not a good acronym, but it's government not coming up with good acronyms all the time. And then that 5 parts per billion number in the percentage. So you might see the percentage is 10,000, but the actual amount that you consume could be below California Proposition 65 if it's something that you're consuming only a little bit of. Like, realistically, you don't eat that much of spices, right? Like, I know some people more than others, but you're not out here consuming 10, 20 grams of spices. So the stuff that typically has the most lead in it is by and large not as risky, like, if you take into account how much you actually consume. Like tooth powder, for example. Like, all right, first of all, like toothpaste, like, there's a lot of different toothpaste that have lead, and ones that are made of, like, dust, essentially, typically have more lead than ones that are just made of, like, sodium lauryl sulfate, like, and fluoride. And there's arguments for each one being, more safe, but at the end of the day, you don't really eat the toothpaste, hopefully. And so if you have a kid that doesn't eat the toothpaste, it spits out 95% of it, and they're only putting 1 gram of it in their mouth, even if it has, you know, 5,000 parts per billion, like, they're probably not gonna consume a meaningful amount of lead because they're not eating the toothpaste, and the only amount that they're being exposed is really low.
Yeah, tooth powder's a one out there on social media, that's for sure, and again, it comes back to doing the correct measurements because no child is most likely going to eat the whole jar of tooth powder in one sitting.
I would hope
So,
not. Yeah, probably not. And so but there's the thing about lead is there's a lot of nuance, and it's a very, like, scientifically intense topic because there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of different units of measure, and there's a lot of different things to take into account. Like, when you do total digestive testing of food, of salt, of tooth powder, whatever, you wind up getting the total amount of lead that's literally in there. And that doesn't account for the fraction of that that's not bioavailable and won't dissolve. So if you have lead in certain forms, you could eat unlimited amounts of it. If I have lead phosphate, it doesn't dissolve in human stomach acid. I could eat a gram of lead phosphate, a million micrograms, and nothing's going to happen because it won't dissolve. It will pass through me. So when you have lead in different products, if it's in food, it's probably pretty bioavailable because it dissolved in the water enough to be uptaken into the roots. But if you have it in some powder type thing or salt, for example, it may very well not be bioavailable. But the laboratories do total digestion using nitric acid, hydrochloric acid at an elevated temperature and pressure for an extended period of time until there's nothing left except for inorganic analytes, elements in the solution. And then they feed that into the spectrometer. So partial digestive testing just isn't something that's done because that's just the laws don't take that into account. They take total lead into account only. And there's it's the scientific aspect of lead that, like, makes it kind of confusing. And then the regulatory aspect is like, once you filter science through politicians, you know, some people don't even know how the internet works.
that's hilarious. Well, okay, so one of those things, though, might be bentonite clay that you're talking about that might just pass right through your system.
It might, and I'm not gonna say that I know if it does or not, but, like, it's definitely not certainly bioavailable 100% because it's not there's no evidence to suggest that it would be. It's not been taken up into an animal or plant. Um, you know, it's just not, and it's in the physical I wouldn't eat bentonite clay, though. I know some people do, they think that has benefits, but I'm not an advocate for that.
Okay, so there is a lot of noise out there about lead, and it's really confusing to people because I had a lady last week who just was like, "Oh my gosh, I cannot believe I have fed my kids lead before." And I was like, "Well, you're feeding them lead every day if they're eating fruits and veggies, most likely. I mean, they're eating it." Like she was just freaking out, like, "I can't believe they are having lead." And I'm like, "We've got to understand this that you cannot avoid it. There's so many people out there on the internet just scaring all these new moms about lead. It's a confusing topic. So what do you say to all these followers that are listening to all this noise back and forth? What do you say to them?
I would say don't, take it with a grain of salt, because really, like, you know, there's lead everybody used to be exposed to so much lead, and so I was born in 1992. I no doubt had an elevated blood lead beyond 3.5 when I was born, just as a function of being inside my mom. My mom had lead in her blood, and she had lead in her bones. When people become pregnant, a lot of the calcium from their bones goes into their blood and then into the baby. So right there's already been a transfer of lead into the baby. Like, what are you gonna do? Not have kids because you might give them some of your own lead? Like, obviously, parents should try to reduce their own lead consumption and make the environment safe to the best of their ability. But like, the system's not perfect. We can't like say, oh, well, we won't do anything if it's not perfect, because then we won't do anything at all. We'll just sit here and be ridden with anxiety, say, oh my gosh, and then we'll wait around until we die inevitably anyway. So understanding life as like a gift that we can enjoy, even though it is imperfect, is something that really allows us to function in the face of adversity. And lead has unfortunately been released into the environment in these various ways. Understanding the context and understanding what exposure routes really matter is definitely going to relieve a lot of anxiety from parents. And I've had a lot of people tell me, um, like after either consuming my content or using the kit in their house, they were like, wow, I was able to see like what was actually going on. I was able to see how when I clean up, there's no more lead dust. And I can, I threw out all these dishes that had lead. I was feeding my kid off these plates, or I was going to. And so that, just understanding the topic more, there's this like chart where if you have very low skill or information in an area, and or as a skill inside, I don't remember, but there's some matrix that shows that you're gonna have a lot of anxiety when you don't have a lot of information and skill. And when you get that, you get those skills and you get that understanding, the anxiety goes away because riding a bike is easy when you know what to do with the pedals and the everything. But when you haven't done it before, it's like, wow, this is overwhelming. And this has definitely been an overwhelming topic for me to understand at times because it just seems like there's so many ways to be exposed. And I know a lot of people just kind of freak out about it. And I don't think that that's a good thing because that doesn't really help. What is freaking out, panicking, not going to do anything because you can't do anything about certain sources and some of them don't matter as much as other ones.
Well, I love what you said that life isn't perfect and products aren't perfect. The food isn't perfect, so we do our best. We eliminate where we can and eliminate with like the paint in our house and the dust and all those things that you said. Okay, so if my followers are concerned that they do have a child or themselves they have too much lead, are there certain things that they can do to help detox that lead out?
Definitely. Primarily, they can stop doing something, which is being exposed. Because every day our bodies assimilate some fraction of our blood lead into our bones, and the half life of blood lead is about 3 months. So it's typically understood that after five half lives, you have virtually nothing left in your blood. So after like a year of some exposure, you'll have like virtually none of that exposure will be left in your blood. It'll all be in your bones. And 95% of all lifetime lead stays in the bones permanently, which isn't really the worst thing nowadays. There's not that much lead in the environment versus where there used to be. So Our bones can handle that amount of lead. The bones are kind of like a closet in your bedroom for lead. Like, you can put stuff that's on the floor into the closet up to a point, but eventually it's just gonna come spilling out. So we're not at that point today, having no lead in the gas, having relatively low amounts of lead in the food and in the paint. Um, if somebody really wants to accelerate the, like, letdown of lead from their blood, they can try to consume modified citrus pectin, garlic. These things tend to bind to lead, and you will then excrete them. So,
So do you
uh,
think most people or everyone is walking around with lead some type of lead levels in their blood?
yes, but they're below the levels that are clinically significant in almost all cases, which is like, if you have a blood level below 1, you're not gonna have clinically significant amounts of harm versus the general population. But in order to really understand that, we would need to have people who are, like, born on the moon and consume moon food and consume moon water that has 0 lead, and they have to be born in test tubes because their parents would give them some lead at birth. So these lead-free people don't exist, and I'm sure that in, like, 200 years, the society will be, like, even more freaked out about lead, and they'll be like, "Yeah, if you have any lead, it's bad." But we live in 2025, like, we gotta take it for what it is, and we're lucky we didn't live in 1925. I mean, gosh. This is the best deal yet. So even though there is still some lead, there's definitely some ways getting it out of your consumption. Throw out the plates. Stop using the window that sheds lead. Stop eating that foreign medicine that you think is helping you, the herbal tea from China or wherever that might have a lot of lead. And then start maybe consuming more of the garlic, might maybe modified citrus pectin. I would shy away from anything like a zeolite. I don't particularly think that that is even safe necessarily. And I don't think that I wouldn't want that in my brain, as some of them say that they can get in there. Just doesn't seem worth it. You're not going to get, it's not going to be able to chelate lead off of your neurons anyway. And most of your blood isn't in your brain. So if you take something like modified citrus pectin or garlic, the sulfur compounds in garlic and the small fragments of fiber in the modified citrus pectin will adhere to the lead, adhere to other heavy elements like cadmium, arsenic, mercury, and you'll wind up excreting them through your kidneys.
And a whole food diet is going to help as well with all of those cofactors and like we talked earlier, that will help eliminate that stuff out of the body as well.
Yeah,
So,
not being one more thing, not being deficient in calcium is super important also. Since the body mistakes lead for calcium, if your body is lacking calcium, you're not going to be, like, excreting very much lead at all. It's gonna stay in your blood.
interesting. That's good to know. Thank you so much for being here and informing my followers more on this topic so that they can have that knowledge to be more empowered to make the choices that's best for them. And so tell my listeners where they can find your test and also where they can learn more from you.
Detectlead.com. Where else? You'll find the test on that site, or it's on Amazon. It's called Fluorospec. And then my Instagram handle is Eric Everything Led. I do put out content on some other channels too, but it is a very, I probably shouldn't have made the name Eric Everything Led because it's kind of gotten really expansive, and I always try to DIY everything. So we'll get to those things eventually, but those are the places you can follow more of my stuff.
Oh, perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. I always end my episodes by asking my listeners what they have found to be the best ingredient in life. And what would you say that is?
Definitely information. Without information, life is much harder and much more intimidating. And I found to be have access to the internet, learning stuff is really, like, put me in a place where I can actually act accordingly if I consume the right information. And I, just really read, like, Wikipedia and very sanitized, personal opinion laden documents to get the information that I try to apply to my life because you can never trust the news.
Well, knowledge is power. So I always say do your own research, look into it yourself. But knowledge is power and empowers you to make the best choice for you and your family. So I love that that is your best ingredient in life. And again, you guys, if you're interested, if you have lead in your home or dishes or toys or glassware, check out his test, order it, check it yourself because knowledge is power. And again, just like he said, let's calm down the fears of lead in food. Lead is in food. And we also know our bodies know how to eliminate it, which is an amazing thing that nature has given us. And so, again, thank you, Eric, for spending time with me today. And everyone, go give him a follow. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe to the Just Ingredients podcast to learn more about your health and good ingredients to life. Plus, get daily tips at just.ingredients on Instagram.